A very warm welcome to this Farmers Weekly transition webinar. I hope you're well. I hope you've got yourself in the farm kitchen and made yourself a cup of tea and you're thawing out, having probably like me spent most of the day thawing out all the things you didn't think would freeze, but did, and all the ones that freeze every year and catch you out. I'm Hugh Broom. Normally I present the Farmers Weekly podcast, but this evening I'm presenting the webinar, which is going to discuss how you stress test your farm business, measuring how vulnerable you are to changes in interest rates, market price fluctuations, inflation, and rising input costs could make a big difference between success and failure. And in this transition webinar, we will explore how all these factors influence your farm's working capital, what changes should be implemented to make your farm more resilient, financial modeling, why, how should you do it, and how are your gearing rates, borrowing, assets and liabilities affecting your business. So we have got lots to cover. We have got an esteemed panel of four to introduce to you as well. And don't forget, you can take part as well on your screen where you interface this webinar. There is a chat box and you can submit questions to the panel through that chat box. And please, if you do, please tell us who you are and where you are. And if you want to be really brave, tell us what you're farming, because it's great to hear where everyone is and what they are doing. But before we introduce the panel, we're going to take a video from one of our commercial partners, Bayer.
From our point of view, sustainability means growing crops, continue to grow crops, but making the best use of the resources that we have. So some fields will come out of production if they are unable to sustain the crops there and produce a profit. What we've been doing until we've had these big changes in terms of government support and now huge changes in the price of inputs, what we've been trying to do is even up the production across the field so that you are getting the good areas to work harder and the poorer areas to try and catch up with the good areas, so that you even it out and then that pushes up your overall yield. I think going forward what we've got to do is actually treat those areas separately. So if the poor area is never going to produce as much as the good area in terms of profitability, then you scale down what you do to it. So where we need to go now is identify those areas and then identify areas of varying the inputs that go onto it to the point where it's profitable, but it's not creating a loss. And the bit that's hyper profitable is creating a bigger profit. Yeah, so what we're looking for is consistent data that says that particular area in the farm doesn't produce a profit year after year after year. It's not just a one-off, one year it didn't do particularly well, next year it was okay. So you need this data build up that you can then start saying, right, that area of the field is the field that I won't grow my break crops in, or that area of the field is the one that I'm going to scale down my inputs when I've got my profitable crop of wheat in there, and put all the inputs onto the bit there that is going to produce the profit. So the thing I like about field view is that you are able to take chunks of the field and divide it up, and if, for instance, this year we've done some nitrogen trials, so I can take those nitrogen trials out of the middle of the field, compare the yield with that with the section next to it, which had a different rate of nitrogen in it, to the section further down the field which had yet another amount of nitrogen on it, and then we can compare that and say, right, there is a yield benefit or a yield loss from doing a specific trial.
You're back in the room.
Thank you very much. Welcome back to our webinar. So we're going to introduce your panel for this evening. First, we have Will Foyle, who's a farm business consultant with Hutchinson's. Will's breadth of experience in farm business consultancy and as a rural chartered surveyor allows him to support farmers with the challenges they face. Since graduating from Harper Adams in 2015, Will has assisted many farm businesses in setting and achieving long, medium and short-term goals to help them close cope with change. Working closely with Hutchison's agronomy and service teams, will actively seek opportunities for growers that might otherwise be overlooked, and has been pivotal in developing Omnia's industry-leading farm business performance tools to increase performance on business. Welcome this evening, Will. We also have Jeff Claydon. He's the CEO of Claydon Drills. Jeff's been running the family farm since the young age of 16 and has planted this crops already for his 53rd harvest in charge of the farm. Now, over that time, he's learned a lot about stress testing the family's arable farming business, including measuring yields to see the output figures of his crops, back when he invented and patented the first internally fitted combine yield meter, the Claydon Yieldometer, back in 1981. It went to be fitted to most mega and dominator class combines that came into the UK through the 80s and 90s. And over the years, Jeff has tried all means of crop establishment techniques on the farm's heavy Suffolk clay soils, with a view to always maximize yield, but at realistic costs. The low grain price back in the early 2000s hit on farm margins big time, and that led to the design and the launch of the Claydon Direct Seed Drill, a machine and system designed to reduce costs but without losing yield, thus allowing higher margins on the Claydon and other arable enterprises. 20 years later, Claydon Seed Drill's business is booming in over 30 countries worldwide and bringing profitability to the Claydon's home farm. Tim Mason joins us from the Environment Bank tonight. Tim's demonstrated a history of working within the agricultural industry. Following work as an arable operator in East Anglia, Tim undertook an MSc in Rural Land and Business Management at the University of Reading before embarking on a career as a land agent with a large national property firm. Following this, he spent 2 years working with the CLA, advising members in the Southwest on land and rural property related matters, as well as contributing to lobbying at local and national government levels. As a chartered surveyor experienced in the rural sector, Tom is now working with farmers and landowners to ensure delivery of strategically located habitat banks across the Southwest. Tom Mason, Senior Land Manager at Environment Bank. And last but not least, we have Tim Coates, who is the co-founder and Chief Customer and Regulatory Officer at the Oxbury Bank. Tim's experience combines financial and agricultural knowledge and expertise derived from being a fourth-generation family farmer, now managing over 2,500 acres of farming enterprises, specialising in regenerative and nature-positive farming, and participates in a number of natural capital markets. Before co-founding Oxbury Bank, where he leads on strategic and product development and holds the prescribed responsibility for managing climate-related financial risks, Tim was subject matter expert at the authorization of new banks at the Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA, where he also worked as part of the Executive Office on strategic issues for conduct regulation, and was the team that operationalized the payment system regulator. Previously, Tim worked in consulting, advising clients in the financial services, energy and healthcare sectors. Tim holds an MSc in financial economics. Welcome. Thank you, Tim. Welcome to all our panel members this evening. As I said earlier on, don't forget, if you want to ask a question, on your screen you'll see there is a text box, and please, as we get into the questions, and if it springs anything to mind, get typing away in that text box. And if you can put who you are and where you're from, that would be brilliant as well. But without further ado, let's get on. We've had various questions submitted prior to this evening's webinar. The first one I'm going to ask, which actually was submitted to us by TC, and it's a pretty generic one, but I think it's one that a lot of farmers think about all the time. How big should my overdraft be? And without further ado, I'll throw that straight to Tim, to the banker in the room. How big should that be, Tim? What should be the rule? Is there a rule of thumb, or is it totally dependent on the type of business?
It is going to depend on the type of business, but I think the question is probably best looked at by going back a step and saying, actually, what should my working capital requirement be for my business, right? And the best way of looking at that is to think about what's called the current ratio. which essentially is just your current assets divided by your current liabilities. So essentially, what are you going to be able to generate income from in the next 12 months divided by what it's going to cost you over the next 12 months. You could put that another way. If it's at the end of harvest and you've got a full shed, what's the, what am I going to get out of that, and what's going to cost me to replace that value of that stock over the coming year? So that kind of conceptual thing. So if you do that division and you get a number that's sort of about 1, you're probably in about the right place. You shouldn't be going forwards or backwards too far. Ideally, you want it nicely above 1, but probably not as high as 2. If you're going up to 2, you're probably not actually putting enough energy into pushing the business forward. If you're below 1, you're probably holding too much cost, and that could include financial costs. So your overdraft would be in your current liabilities. So that starts to tell you if it's in there, you've got an idea of whether it's too big or too small based on that calculation, which is going to be applicable to your business, whatever you're doing. There are other rules of thumb out there. Some people often talk about sort of about 50% of your total revenues on any given year. It's going to depend on exactly what business you're doing, how diversified you are, how seasonal your cash flow is within the year. But typically, really, it's about can you ensure that you can afford it going forward? Because it's many overdrafts, of course, are going up at present, as well as costs going up as well. So it's an additional cost that's going up. So it has to be considered all in the round. But it's often something it's a good thing to investigate whether or not you've got it sort of set at the right level, whether you can afford it, and then if it's appropriate to your particular type of farm business.
And would you say there's any rules of thumb around sort of gearing? Because I mean, traditionally, farmers, okay, it doesn't apply to everyone, but owner-occupier farmers would look at, we own this much asset and we're borrowing this against it, and it's only 5% of our total wealth. We're fine. But that can obviously lead to some, but it's not very revealing in some cases, because you could be fine and only 5%, but massively unprofitable.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's exactly, and it's easy that that your overdraft and your gearing ratio are not related particularly, except that your overdraft is making up probably a component part of how geared you are. Your gearing essentially is just the amount of debt you carry as a business compared to your total asset value or equity value of the business, whereas your overdraft is essentially is a 12-month snapshot. It should always be coming back to your 12 months for your overdraft, and your gearing is your long-term look. And you're quite right. Owner occupiers on large land may have a ratio that's much lower than you'd expect in compared to other farming businesses, or compared to any businesses actually in the wider economy, which is just a function of high land values. And as you say, doesn't mean that you're actually in a very good cash position, nor does it mean that you might not end up having to make some pretty uncomfortable choices if you do just find that you're actually losing money year on year.
Jeff, you've been farming 53 harvests now. What's your view on borrowing? And as a farmer, how do you think about borrowing?
Yes, we've been borrowing money most of my farming career. I remember coming home and father not being particularly well, and we were well borrowed back then, probably about 100,000 in 1970 on 250 acres, which would be pretty high geared, because I mean, land then was about, I don't know, £400 an acre, unlike today. And so I think my father being ill, we were very lucky, because the bank manager didn't make us sell some land to pay the overdraft off. And we then went into the early 70s and joined the EU, and wheat prices doubled, and we were suddenly bailed out by the prices coming forward. So as a young man, I learned very quickly that we had to try and make sure that we're as efficient as we possibly could and grow as much as we could as cheap as we possibly could. We then sort of bought more land in '86, and we managed to fix the interest rate, which is going to be an interesting one for everybody, because the borrowing that you have is one thing, but it's the amount of interest you're paying and whether you can actually afford that. And I remember it's terrifying in 1986, because most of the bank interest then was anywhere around about 12% or 10%. We fixed the value of that land. We bought 120 acres and we fixed it at 12%. Unfortunately, we did, because shortly after that went up to 18%. And that would have probably been unmanageable back then. So I think, you know, when you're borrowing money, you need to look at your interest rates and the risk of whether they're going to go up. I mean, we're record low interest rates at the moment. And I guess that land, you know, around about £10,000 an acre virtually equates to the same as land at £1,000 an acre at 10%. So when you look at that, you can see that land values today, the interest is not so different. But if interest rates continue to be pushed up, you know, that could actually get very tight for some businesses if they're borrowing quite a lot of money. So really, you have to do your sums, know what your costs are, very much so, and look at that and keep it fairly simple. And hopefully, you know, we will get through this storm, particularly with the volatile prices we have at the moment.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's a given, isn't it? You need to know the detail. You need to know the costs if you're actually going to make a plan. Tom, you're out and about and you're trying to get farmers engaged in environmental schemes, whatever that may be within the envelope of the land that they're managing, renting, farming, owning, whatever. And I mean, do you see, I mean, this is, you know, we talk about overdrafts, we talk about borrowing, the sort of long-term arrangements you might be able to buddy farmers up with could potentially help reduce that over time.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, and you know, a lot of the farmers that we're seeing out and about, of course, one of their biggest concerns at the moment is this kind of volatility and uncertainty in the market. And I think what does attract them to something we are, or the product that we're offering is that, you know, it will provide some long-term certainty over, you know, X number of hectares potentially of their holding, which they know what's going to be, you know, what they're going to expect over, you know, a 30-year agreement. And like you say, remove some of that volatility and some of that uncertainty, but by also, you know, hopefully providing a good injection of cash for them within, you know, into their farming business.
That's brilliant. I'm going to move on to the next question because I'm going to give that straight to Will, which is, we're talking about, you know, stress testing and resilience of your business. How useful, this question is one of the ones that's been set in, how useful is working out my cost of production as a management tool? Will, is cost of production, is it the be all and end all when you're working out your overall numbers and your strategy going forward?
I wouldn't say it's the absolute be all and end all, Hugh, but I think it is a fundamental, very important part of an arsenal of tools that you should be using. I often say to people, the trouble of analysing your farm accounts is you're looking historically. In the best way, you're looking 12 months backwards. And we only have to look at the last 12 months and the volatility within the market to appreciate that looking 12 months back at my farm accounts, probably, you know, there's something else I could be doing. And cost of production is there and it's live. Certain costs are easier to understand. Your variable costs, you're quite regularly getting an invoice through the post, you know what they are. Other costs are more hidden. Actually did some cost of production analysis only earlier in the week for something else. Without changing variable costs, purely changes in yield and direct costs, we could see cost of production from wheat varying from 150 through to nearly £200 a tonne. And that's pre-rent and finance. So you need to understand where that is before you can start making other decisions on the management of those crops that you're growing. You know your cost of production, you can set a strike price, you can choose how, when, and what quantities you're selling product. And it's part of an overall risk management tool, I suppose, yeah.
And Tim Coates, to you, I mean, in terms of talking about cost of production and working out the numbers, what do you say to your clients when it comes to benchmarking? Because, you know, Will, you just said there's a fair bit of variance between top and bottom end in terms of cost of production a week. Where should I be going to benchmark what I'm doing? Where's the best tool, do you think?
I'm not necessarily going to recommend a single best tool, because that's probably not appropriate, but there are obviously tools out there. AHDB's obviously got a free and publicized, well, I say free, we've paid for it, some of us, to have that there, but they've obviously doing a lot of work on that, which is I'd say is a very good first port of call. And actually it's probably worth signposting the DEFRA funded farming business resilience fund at the moment. There's a number of providers out there who are offering free consultation on this, which includes benchmarking as part of that. So that service from many of those providers, which is incredibly useful, incredibly valuable. I've been through it myself with a provider who I won't name, but there, as I say, because it's a diverse market out there. There's lots of good quality consultants who can support on that, and I would recommend it if you haven't taken it up already. Do so. But interestingly, it's not just on the farm business side of things. There, in terms of the financials, that increasingly starting to bring in other factors of resilience, like environmental considerations as well. That now, so the consultants offering advice on that. So, a top recommendation is to make sure that you've taken part of that. DEFRA's paying for it, so let's make sure we're using it.
Yeah, and presumably you get regional variation. Jeff, when you're benchmarking, I mean, when you look at your farm near Newmarket, clearly you're comparing with other farmers around Newmarket. And all you lot in East Anglia can generally look out to the rest of us and smugly look at your yields. But I mean, how have you always worked benchmarking and the cost of production on your unit?
We obviously want to maintain as much yield as we can, because with the money coming in, and if we grow the crop as cheaply as we possibly can, but still maintain the yield and the quality, we're really starting to win. I have a customer who farms 1,200 hectares not far from here. He's just a father and son outfit, and he has one worker for 3 weeks at harvest time. And he runs a 10-meter combine and a 30-meter self-propelled sprayer and a 350 horsepower Challenger, a 15-meter set of rolls and a Claydon drill. His total fuel usage for the whole farm this year from planting till harvest and harvesting was only 40 litres a hectare. Now, his costs are tremendously down compared to a lot of other people. But the most important thing, his yields are up there at 10 tonnes a hectare. So, with low costs like that, with less labour and less machinery, he's actually coming in. And the AHDB did the benchmarking, and we saw some results from them a couple of years ago. And these would be much higher today because of the machinery costs and diesel costs and labour costs. And the lowest was obviously a direct drilling situation. It was one of our drills, strangely, and he was £28 a hectare for his crop establishment. This is only the crop establishment. And the highest was £280 a hectare. Now, when you look at that, they both yielded exactly the same yield at 10 tonnes a hectare, which was interesting. And anything else in between varied from 7.5 to 8.5. And that was all AHDB figures. So they came in, and I think, it's absolutely crucial to make sure that you make the best of your job you can, your timings, and get the job right. And benchmarking is great. But I think earlier on in my career, I remember filling in cash flows to my bank manager and then trying to farm to that cash flow. Well, just be a wee bit careful. Don't go and cut things out that are actually going to keep your yield there, because you can cut it out too easily. And many years, well over 40 years of yield measuring, we've been able to work out which ones work well and the ones that we can afford to cut out. And that's where we've arrived to today. So really important to monitor your business and look at those costs that you're doing. And it doesn't matter, like the egg producers at the moment, they're really in a hard place. The supermarkets are holding the price really hard, and they're probably spending 40% more to produce those eggs because cereal prices and all the costs around them have gone up. And there's this massive pressure from the consumer not to let those prices go up. But we as farmers, we've just got to be very careful going forward, because I think, they could could really put a lot of pressure on us as an industry if they hold the prices too
too low. I think many people would say, yeah, I mean, many farmers would say probably that the last 30 years food has been far too cheap, and it's a hard. We've sort of come to the end of the road of 2% inflation every year without having to worry about it. But that's a whole different debate. I'm going to move on to another question now. Again, talking about resilience, talking about future-proofing. What are the biggest steps I could take to future-proof my arable enterprise? Let's hit that one back to Will. Will, what would your sort of top 3, top 4 things be when you're sat down there trying to strip it out and lock down as much as you can to avoid this volatility?
I think measuring is the first thing, Hugh. It's alarming the amount of businesses I go to that really don't have any sort of tools of measurement, shall we say. I know we've just used the word benchmarking, which is looking externally, but actually look internally at your business. Jeff created yield monitoring systems back in the 80s, and they are fantastic. But the amount of people I go to that stick that on a memory stick in the drawer and pull it out when they have a rainy day to remind themselves of better times is quite astronomical. But if that is your fundamental base data, and if you start to understand other things, cost of production being one, and the relationship between yield, your direct cost, your fixed costs, you can then start to use that as a tool to manage for the future. So I then go into a phrase I call improve or remove. If I've got a yield map and I've got a cost structure, I can make a variable rate profit and loss map for that field. I can then start to assess the areas that are not making me money, and that will be stark. I think a lot of people, the average really does smooth out things more than you think. There's a lot of land out there that, small percentages of land that really don't make money. And actually your good land makes you more money than you believe. There are measures, there are ways to improve that, still crop it, look at different cropping scenarios, or you may fall into the remove sector where you start looking at short or long-term alternative uses for that land. So I suppose my 3 things, are measure, manage from that, and look at improve or remove.
No, that's pretty good. Presumably, if you remove, Tom, you're the man to come in and come up with something novel to do with that land that you've taken out of production. I mean, there are things presumably you can do to help your business going forward and improve your financial resilience.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, and there's so many of the landowners that approach us, they tend to we tend to go out and see them on farm, and it's kind of that initial conversation of working out with them, where they feel, are areas on the farm that may not be performing, whether it be, we use all the same inputs across our arable land, but for some reason this 20 hectares here doesn't perform the way the rest of the farm does. We don't get the same yields, whatever it may be. And for us to create our habitat banks, obviously those that's ideal from our position, because we're not taking the most productive land out of food production. But we're offering them an alternative land use that is a long-term land use change, but an alternative land use that should hopefully bring in a good return for them over that 30-year period. And like you say, gives them some more resilience to potentially invest elsewhere in the business. Plenty of landowners we've spoken to already, where we're kind of progressing towards putting together sites with them, and they're looking at actually, well, the capital that we're bringing in from this may let us go and do other diversification projects we haven't been able to do, in the past few years, because we haven't been able to secure the finance, or we haven't wanted to increase our debt exposure. And that's we're really kind of glad to be able to be in a position to help landowners with that.
And Tim, from the banking perspective, what are your sort of mantras that you say to your customers, your arable customers, indeed any of your farming customers, in terms of trying to future-proof what they're doing?
Well, I would echo the point around good data and measurement, and that internal piece that Will was mentioning. But actually, this is not something I say with my banking hat on, but back on the farm, the thing I've been sort of wrestling with, trying to answer on this is, what can I do with the things that I get for free? as it were. So let's talk about the very valuable thing that falls out of the sky. It's actually the most crucial thing in all of arable crop production is what's going on with your water holding capacity in your soils, right? So what can I do through my choices in terms of how I manage that arable business to maximize water retention throughout the season, particularly when we're talking about the kind of dry springs and summers that we've had the past couple of years and are likely to be forecast going into the future. So actually considering a range of options that could be in that around water holding capacity is quite important. And actually onto that, we are getting these hotter, drier springs and summer as well. The sun is also that's energy that's coming out of the sky again for free. So focusing on ensuring everything's in the right best place to make advantage of that is pretty crucial. What with the other choices being things that aren't free and are increasing in price. So it's been a big focus for me for the past couple of years, thinking about that side of the equation, the natural side of the equation, rather than just trying to tinker around with my cost of production, as it were, which obviously is a big factor as well.
Yeah, I mean, you can go, like you say, so it's the stuff that isn't fixing your this price or fixing that price, but yeah, as you say, it's the really simple stuff, as is generally the way. It's the simple stuff that's there. Jeff, the first thing you're going to tell us is that we need to buy one of your drills to future-proof our arable enterprise. But before you do that, I mean, again, thinking about direct drilling and what you've been doing for 20 years and developing the product you've developed, presumably it's partly about acquiring the right bit of kit to do the job, but it's also about transitioning your system, your soil, to get it to where you want it.
Yes, you're 100% right there, Hugh. I mean, so many people just go and buy a direct drill. Perhaps they get a grant on one and, yeah, we'll have a direct drill. We'll just go and buy the first one we can get hold of. I'd strongly recommend that they pop round and find locally people who've got those drills before they buy one and have a look at how they're performing on that soil type, because all the drills will perform on the right soil types. And we've been really fortunate. We're seeming to be reliable and consistently getting those yields over the last 20 years. And as you're rightly saying, the soil, you need to look at your farm. I mean, those fields that are not performing, that we've already mentioned, why are they not performing? Is it a fertility thing? Is it drainage? It's looking at those things in those fields and trying to do a few soil tests, go check that drainage. If it's standing with water, why is it standing with water? Is it because the drainage has failed or the ditches are not clean? That's the very first thing I do when I take on land, is clean the ditches and check the drainage and get it as good as I can. And normally it sorts out a lot of those bad areas on our heavy soil up here. The other thing is to take a spade and have a little look at the soil and smell it and see if you've got worms in it and if it's healthy and it smells nice. It's no good going into a field that's as dead as a pancake and got no air in it and is sour. You're not going to get a good result direct drilling. So from a transitional point of view, you really need to go and inspect your field. If the water's not draining away, why isn't it? As we said earlier, check that. If your drainage is right, if you've taken a brilliant crop off a field, 9-10 tons or whatever is brilliant for your soil type, you pretty much can go straight into that field and drill it and get a very good result, even with any of the direct drills, provided that they are the right drill for your soil type in that area. And when I go back to the 70s, the ADAS then produced maps where disc drills work quite well. And I think our area here was the area which had a big red cross and it said, disc drills will not work. And when I looked at it, I thought we've got to do something different. So that's where we came from with a strip tillage angle, which puts air and moisture, brings the moisture up and gets the crop away to a really, really good start. And I think that's the difference between our drill and some of the others. I'm not saying the others are bad. I'm saying they'll work for some people, but not for all of the people and all of the land.
There we go. Thank you very much for that. Look, don't forget, if you want to send us a question, you can. On your screen, you will see that you have a little box and you can type your question in there and you can get our experts to answer your question. And if you put your name and where you're from, that would be lovely as well. So please send some of those questions in if anything crops up in your mind that you want to ask. feel free to do that. Right. So we've talked about resilience. We're talking about resilience. And one question that's come in and I'm going to put this one back to Will first, actually, because it's something he's probably doing battle with some of his clients to try and calm them down a bit. With grain prices so high, shouldn't my main focus be on yield at all cost? Will, I mean, presumably that's a thought that's been going through a lot of people's heads, although obviously those grain prices have come back from the crazy highs they were back in sort of May, June of this year.
I think yield can do an awful lot to cover a lot of sins, Hugh. And obviously within reasonable parameters, I would always encourage somebody to push yield, as I'm sure anyone else on this panel would. But I think you have to understand the cost structure behind that, the associated risk with what you're doing. Probably in an arable context, that's quite low. But yeah, yield will go a long way to cover a lot of sins. The cost of production worker referred to. The easiest way to lower your cost of production is typically to increase your yield. You've got a dilution effect there, and someone pushing 10, 11, 12 tons to the hectare is going to pretty much always have a lower cost of production than somebody down at 6 or 7 on an incredibly low input system. Not always. I've seen figures at both ends of the scale. You need to understand the figures. I think the other thing I would just add in yield and the yield dilution effect, the carbon world that we're going into, the carbon cost of growing crops, again, yield is absolutely fantastic at diluting the carbon cost of that crop as well, within reasonable parameters, understanding fuel and fertilizer being your two biggest carbon costs. So yes, push yield, understand the cost behind it though.
Absolutely. And Tom, in terms of when you're working with farmers in terms of developing their environmental side and trying to optimize the environmental output of their land, is there a point, have you started to find is there a sort of a, if you will, a benchmark, a stress point at which the land is given to you to go and work your magic on and give us some consistent income versus what they were getting inconsistent income previously?
Yeah, I think that there is an element, of that. But I suppose at the moment with us, we've given how new of a market this is, I suppose there's so many landowners with so many different motives coming to us. In some cases, it has been that point. I think actually for a lot of farmers we're speaking to, I think the tipping point has probably been a lack of certainty over forthcoming government funding, particularly. We know BPS is going, and we've got an idea of what's coming down the line to replace that, but actually we haven't got really any detail on this. Whereas with what we're offering, we're very upfront, early on in the process about, well, this is what we feel you could earn off of this Habitat Bank site through the rent and the management fees that we'll pay them to manage the site. And I think, for people, it's the long-term security, I think, that's really attractive. Somebody I spoke to last week, we were discussing about how, SFI, or Sustainable Farming Incentive, is open for applications at the moment, but we still don't actually know yet what the government is offering in terms of payment rates and things like that. And they just said how we expected to try and go into something where we just don't know how it's going to look 12, 24, 36 months down the line, let alone years down the line. So I think, that peace of mind and the long-term kind of security is something that is really attracting farmers.
Tim, do you have to stop some of your customers chasing yield too hard and covering up the book of sins that lies beneath it?
Well, we're not prescriptive about what anyone should be doing. Let's be clear about that. But we're very non-judgmental. But obviously, what we're concerned about is in lending to someone is there's a range of things, but affordability is in there, and a good indicator of ongoing affordability in terms of being able to pay us back is profitability. So we're much more interested, I suppose you could say, in really pushing that what's the cost of production conversation, so that actually you can show that you're making a good profit margin, and it's not all about the yield. But maybe I'm just biased because I'm on grade 3 Cotswold Brash, and I can only dream of Jeff's soils and yields. So whatever I might try and throw at it. So maybe I have come at it from a different angle, but generally from a banking perspective, affordability and profitability and good cash flow management.
Absolutely. Look, we're going to take a break. We'll be right back after this message from one of our other partners, Trinity Ag. And we're back, and you are indeed listening to the Farmers Weekly Transition webinar, talking about stress testing your business. Marilyn Purchase, Ashmead Farming, has sent a message through the portal on the page in front of you. She's telling me off because we haven't talked about beef and sheep systems enough. And, you know, as a beef farmer myself, Marilyn, I was thinking exactly that. So it's a good point. Where we've talked about stress testing with regards general financial, with regards arable. Will, a lot of your clients must, you know, have mixed enterprises as well as arable enterprises. So when you're on farm dealing with clients who have mixed enterprises, when we talk about stress testing and resilience within those mixed farm businesses, I mean, presumably things like growing as much as your own feed as you can, it's an obvious way to try and reduce your exposure to lumps and bumps going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. I mean, my comments around cost of production equally as relevant to a livestock enterprise as they are an arable enterprise or a horticultural enterprise, etc. I appreciate maybe not as easy to pull out those costs, but what can a beef and sheep farmer do to help with resilience? I think you're right, as much as possible, homegrown feeds, contracts, both for purchases and sales, and lock in prices and understand where that cost matrix is, understand if there's a profit margin there to be made. At times when maybe that's harder, within reason, look at other measures to help or scale back, and when you know there's a profit, you need to push for it. But yeah, in terms of resilience, what would I be saying to a livestock farmer when I go to them? It is grow as much as you can at home, look at alternative income streams, which is where Tom would come in. But actually the SFI for intensive grassland is probably the best of the bunch out there at the moment. I'd certainly be saying to people, look at that. We've still got a year in which we could be applying to countryside stewardship. I have a lot of dairy guys that have moved away from maize and onto whole crop spring cereals, accepting that there's going to be a bit of a change in the ration, but there's an element of income guaranteed through the stewardship from that. And maize longer term probably isn't helping their soils. There's a whole range of things to be out there, but it's have an open mind. Look at how much you can ring fence things within home, and then for things that you are buying in, what contract terms can you buy on compared to the sales. And if you can link the two and guarantee a margin in the middle, that's the holy grail.
And as you say, it is all about data. It is knowing exactly what you're doing. It's knowing exactly what your animals are performing in exactly the same way. It's knowing exactly how your wheat's growing and what it's going to yield. Tim, when we talk about the over the farm gate going out, I mean, from your day-to-day working in the variety of farm businesses that you do work in, do you see anything that gives a more resilient marketplace for livestock producers out there?
Yeah, well, actually, it's your point about looking outside the gate, actually, I think, which is quite interesting here. And obviously, Will just alluded to mixed farming. And I think so I'm in a farmer cluster myself, which involves a variety of enterprises of different types. And actually, one of the great strengths that we've been able to do through that is ensure that there's some form of essentially sort of circular economy going on between ourselves. So that's the sort of thing where for example, I buy a lot of poultry litter from the chicken farmer down the road. I also I'm now mixed. I graze sheep in within my arable rotation, so integrated livestock management, which is a huge way of I address my cost of production actually. So it's actually I think there's a lot of this thing about looking around to actually how do you form partnerships if you're a livestock farmer with your other arable farmers in your area who may be able to supply you, or you may be able to supply services to them. There's quite a good lot of synergies that can be incentivized, I think, now in where we are. And I think necessity is the mother of all innovation, right? So looking at where we are now, it's time to start having those conversations either formally or informally to get that going. And those businesses that are participating in those kinds of conversations and putting those kinds of arrangements in place are sort of cutting out a lot of middlemen and saving themselves quite a lot of money along the way.
Yeah, it's acting as a collective, isn't it? And optimizing everyone's assets. Tom, you're from an environment bank point of view, I mean, some livestock farms and some not particularly sexy livestock pastures, although they might have some carbon and habitat value, don't have a lot of output value. I mean, they're prime for you to come and do something with, aren't they, in terms of into one of your schemes?
Yeah, certainly. A lot of farmers we go out to see will be potentially mixed acreages, or obviously down in the southwest, plenty of livestock units as well. And yeah, certainly for us, where we can achieve enough uplift in biodiversity from improving those grasslands, we certainly take on sites like that. And also one of the things that I think is really important for us to stress is, I think for some people within the farming community, they still think of potentially having an environmental land use like that kind of completely prohibits agricultural use of that land, or kind of integration between the two. But of course, for us, one of the key management actions with our habitat banks is actually that we would like them grazed throughout the year, kind of low intensity grazing, actually providing a lot of the habitat management kind of objectives that we want is achieved through low density, predominantly cattle grazing, but there are other options as well. So not only are you getting an income from the land for an environmental purpose, say such as biodiversity net gain, but also still providing some forage, although not the same kind of quality of forage as you may have had before, or not supporting the same head of cattle as it may have done before, but still adding some value to the agricultural business as well as the an alternative source of income.
Yeah, and you've got the consistency of that source of income coming in over the long term. Jeff, can I drill grass with my Claydon drill?
Definitely, Hugh, you can. We've got lots of grass being reseeded and everything with the drill. No great hassle there. It's very, very good. Also, I have great admiration for livestock farmers, especially like you were saying earlier, out there in the cold, unfreezing water troughs and everything. And as an industry, we need our livestock industry in the UK because I grow a lot of wheat here in East Anglia and other crops, oats and oilseed rape, and they need to be fed to animals here in the UK and converted into higher value produce. And I think as an industry, it's very simple. We all need just to look at our costs, what we're doing, and hopefully get a return. And we're always price takers, which is always a big issue. And I think, there is opportunity with internet and marketing, but they've made it so difficult for livestock producers to actually slaughter their own animals and sell those in the open market over the internet. They seem to have closed that down with red tape, as I remember from years ago. And, it would be really nice to see some livestock producers, if they wanted to diversify, perhaps offering more directly to the market, and rather than relying on the supermarkets. And last week there was an excellent article in the Farmers Weekly, Food Prices, Why Farmers Get the Smallest Share. And it's well worth reading. The bread, it's negligible, the profit of share that we get from bread as arable farmers. And it's 0.03% profit that the livestock farmers get for beef burgers. It's a horrifying situation because, going forward, we all need to survive. And what happens if they force us into an abyss to plant these areas up? We have no livestock, and perhaps we could get to the point of food security being a serious issue.
Absolutely. I suppose it's incentivizing people to do the right things to ensure the food security. Thank you, Jeff. We've had another question in, which just sort of goes back a bit. When we started, we talked a bit about overdraft. Steve from Hampshire's sent a text question, and don't forget, using the screen on the text box on the screen in front of you, type in your question, put your name, where you're from. That would be lovely. Steve from Hampshire says, what would be a typical gearing ratio for an owner-occupied farm? Is the one number, Tim Coates?
No, because it depends where you start from. If you see what I mean. So if you've recently acquired that farm and borrowed to do so, you're going to be in a different gearing position than someone who's been there multi-generational, who may be carrying a different level of debt. So there isn't necessarily one size fits all at all. I think the point is the important thing is to make sure you actually know it and know how to manage it, and that you're managing it to a level that is doing two things. One, back to ensuring it's not too high, therefore you're not in an unaffordable situation potentially. But also actually not carrying any debt may mean that you're not investing appropriately in something for the future, which actually debt doesn't have to be an evil thing. It's about the appropriate use of it, and actually it may be that you need some extra debt to invest in some form of transition in your business. Maybe it's a new drill, maybe it's something else, but there'll be something that might be able to help you in transition and make you more profitable and therefore affordable going forward.
I'm going to weave in seamlessly. Another question has just come in from Graham Sanders. Hello, Graham. Graham wants to know, he's a financier, banking person. He's talking about stress testing. Where are we to with stress testing? Because, it used to be 3.5% over base stress test when interest rates were like 1%. Are you going in and stress testing loans at 10% now? What's the deal? How do you do that in the current market?
It has increased from previous levels. There's a lot of ways of cutting that particular question, but we're looking at the future path of interest rates that's expected to do, given what everyone believes about inflation today, right? Which is uncertain. Like there's no certainty about where that's going to play out. There's so many big geopolitical factors weighing in here, and therefore the future path of interest rates is also not certain now. We currently think that interest rates are likely to peak within the next 18 months, but we're not expecting much of a taper off then. So there'll be sort of new plateau, new level of normal. But at the same time, 18 months ago, did we know we would be on this path now? Not necessarily. In fact, we didn't expect it to be as high as this. Hence, we do have quite a large range on that stress test. So we are looking at interest rate on the interest rate stress test, being well above a 5% increase from here. Something that we would consider in affordability.
Great. I'm going to move on to another question from Rob Kerr. Thank you, Rob. He says, is anyone concerned about the net zero push in Holland? 3,000 farms of approximately 9,000 currently being, or in the sites, the Dutch government policy currently being offered to be paid out to get off the land. Look, it leads us to a wider question about I suppose, talking about nutrient neutrality, whether that's from a farming perspective, whether that's from a development in an area perspective, and what's going on there. Tom, in terms, I mean, are you starting to get into this nutrient neutrality? That we're starting to see, the requirements for development to happen, and when you're talking to your customers, do you think it could be something that moves into farming here, that we're more scrutinized in terms of how we use our nutrients and where our nutrients end up?
Yeah, so I mean, it certainly comes up in conversation a lot with landowners we're dealing with, as well as internally, to be honest. So yeah, we are speaking to landowners that we are progressing sites with about the potential for some nutrient neutrality or nutrient offsetting projects. The big difficulty at the moment is there's not 100% clarity on how all of these natural capitals can sit together effectively, the whole stacking element of it. So whether you can stack, while there is a lot, but say whether we can stack phosphates and or nitrogen offsetting projects within a biodiversity net gain project, and yes, certainly something we're looking at doing. I certainly think, it is something that farmers are going to have to look at more seriously, I suppose. As we're seeing more and more these problems are here to stay, and not solely attributable to agriculture, but I think it's very important to show that we are doing our part to try and mitigate this as well. So I certainly think that this is definitely a space to be kind of showing an interest in at this stage.
Tim, when you look at new opportunities from a banking perspective, backing projects, I mean, presumably now you have to start thinking about what's its environmental impact, whether that's around nutrient neutrality or managing nutrients and effluents, whatever, an impact, or ammonia, whatever. Is that something you now consider as a banker? Did the people that lend you the money want to know where it's going?
Yeah, absolutely. So absolutely is the short answer. So we take climate and nature risk into consideration in our credit risk decisioning, and then we have a variety of ways we do that. But actually, it's not just a risk factor; it is an opportunity. You've just mentioned nutrient neutrality, and as Tom has alluded to, there's a lot of complications in that particular market to play out. But where that market is starting to emerge, you're talking about £3,000 a credit being talked about, right? And to give a sort of idea of that is that you can get quite a lot of units out of not very big area of 5 hectares of land use change can deliver you sort of 300 units potentially. Right, and suddenly 300 times 3,000, we're into serious numbers suddenly coming in as a diversification that you didn't even know you could do a few years ago. Right,
it's basically a glorified reed bed.
It could be something, but actually, there's a whole range of different land use changes and they vary depending on nitrate or phosphate, which is the issue because in different parts of the country, different. So in the Solent, for example, which is forward on this, it's a nitrate issue. In the Somerset levels, it's a phosphate issue, and there's different prices attached to that issue. But 74 local planning authorities now have some form of nutrient neutrality requirement in place, and that number is growing month on month. So this is something that's going to happen across the entire country eventually. Think about it. The easy way to think about it is we're into nitrate vulnerable zones, but on speed, right? It's coming in a big way, and there is going to be it's a bit of carrot or stick. Do you want to be going there and getting the carrots by actually thinking about your land use change where appropriate to be in that market and actually seeing it as something you're bringing revenue in for, or are we going to be regulated and actually and told we can't do things? And there's taking you back to your Dutch question, there's obviously been the row going on in Wales about the whole country going into an NVZ, and the issues around doing that and what the transition needs to be to support that. And I think the two things that the simple thing I'd say that exists between those two different cases is, can people please ask the farmers for their opinion and input on how this should be done? In Holland they haven't asked, and that's why you've seen the situation there. It's not being done with farmers; it's being done to them, and that's the sort of thing we can't really tolerate as farmers in this country. We shouldn't allow that to happen.
No, like you say, it's about going with the flow in a way, and identifying those opportunities. And it's tricky to do because it's going to be a while till that market settles. Because any accommodation of nutrient harvesting, for example, and giving up land will impact your overall output. So until it's like all these things, so much policy up in the air, trying to work out what's what is tricky. Another question has just come in: how to financially deal with increasingly dry spring crops. Jeff Claydon, how do you deal with increasingly dry springs? We certainly get them here in Surrey, where we get no rain really from, February, end of February till July if we're lucky.
You're dead right there. This last 2 seasons have been rather remarkable. We've had so small amount of rainfall, only about 150 mil, I believe, in the main growing period, and it came in little drops of 3 and 4 millimeters, which landed on the surface and quickly disappeared again. So it was, even though we had some rain, it was not one that would actually go into the ground. It's really interesting because it's all about conserving the moisture in the ground, and this is where we've learned over the last 20 years. If we went straight in the spring, drilled into the ground and squeezed the ground on this clay, the sun comes out, it bakes like a breeze block, like a brick, and all of those seeds just perish and hang on the side wall. And, we end up with about 3-4 tons a hectare of spring crop. We've found a tremendous success in running a simple straw rake over and creating just 2 to 3 centimeters of tilth and placing the seed under that. That seems to act like an insulating blanket and captures the water from underneath and stops it vapping off from the top. You only have to look at your tram lines. They always crack wide open. And in between the tram lines, with this small tilth and with inter-row hoeing as well, we keep that tilth there, and the crops grow really well. So much so that the previous year our spring oats did 7 tons a hectare, and our spring oats this year did 6.1. So, I'm very pleased with that. But I've learned over a lot of years, because I still do all the spraying and some of the drilling and the harvesting myself. So I've been watching these things from the sprayer seat, and that little bit of tilth makes a difference between success and failure. Added to that, the soil health, when you have the straw left from the autumn, it's unbelievable if you chop it and get it onto the ground and the worms feed on that straw. I mean, we can have in the HDB worm things, a dig in the soil, we can find 50 worms in one of those samples. They said if we found 5 or 10, we'd be doing well. And so we're finding massive amounts of worms. We've always got the curlews and seagulls on those fields as well, harvesting those worms. Disappointing, but that's how life is. And they're now all that chopped straw has actually fully disappeared and gone into the soil. Those wormholes have aerated it for the spring. And when we get the rain, the water will go down those. The enetic worms will take it down 2 meters deep, which will fill that reservoir underneath for our spring crops next year. So we're still getting some water leaving the soil and heavy storms through the drains. But, it's all about filling that big battery underneath and then conserving it in there by keeping a small tilth on the top. We found it tremendously successful here.
Thank you, Jeff. And Will, dry springs. I mean, you actually have dry springs up in the north now, and now, Will. I mean, we've had them down here in the south for a long time. What are you tending to do more of now with your clients?
Yeah, we're not used to them in the north. It's a bit of a culture shock. But no, I think the first thing I do is echo what Jeff's saying: soil health, soil structure, and I can have 2 growers either side of a hedge. One copes with dry springs a lot better than the other. There is a point where there's just far too little rain, and no matter what people are doing, there's going to be some sort of crop failure. But the first thing I do is signpost people to our soil health experts, because a day with them is so amazing in what you can actually unlock and learn about your soil. And that's the asset that you're paying £10,000 plus an acre for, and actually have very little knowledge of, comparatively to what there is to learn about soil. So that would be my first starting point. And then I think secondly, the other thing is, I'd say it's attitude to risk. I have some people that will, and typically, owner occupied, less geared farming businesses will have a different attitude to risk to a highly geared contract farming or tenanted business. And if someone wants to really remove that risk, then look at alternative crops. I have a man that basically said any high risk crops, he's removing them for his rotation, and he's going to grow AB15 legume fallow through stewardship as a risk management tool. For some people, that's ludicrous because the chances are they'll make more money, but that's each individual person's attitude to risk.
No, that's cool. Jamie is a student. Jamie Holden. Good evening, Jamie. He's a student at the Royal Agricultural University, formerly the Royal Agricultural College in my day. Not that I was there. I was where you went, Will. He wants to know whether the panel's thoughts on whether the government could be doing more to combat the rise of input costs, mainly fertilizer, really, and stabilising fertilizer supply. Tim Coates, do you think? Is there anything government can do to try and stabilise that? It's a global market, isn't it? But it's key to resilience. It's key to stress testing.
Well, if you're the government doing your resilience testing, if that level, well, why have they let the only 2 fertilizer plants we had in the country go? There's a whole bunch of potential answers to that question, but they sort of temporarily intervened, but didn't feel like their heart was in it, really. And maybe that's they should and could still do more on that side of things. I think it's very hard for them to actually intervene on the price. They're not sufficiently in control, as you say, because we're in global markets. I think the government has clearly picked its lane on strategy, which is to incentivize a range of different farming practices through the environmental land management scheme, even if they can't seem to make their own mind up about exactly where that's all going either. But that's the lane they seem to have picked rather than price intervention, and I think that's going to be a debate that rumbles on for many years to come.
For some time, I mean, Jamie says, would they be better spent on helping people diversify their farm holdings income stream, which sort of touches on that. Tom, I mean, you touched on it in terms of still the confusion and the lack of clarity in terms of government policy when it comes to land management. I mean, presumably having some good solid policy where, hey, we could make a 10-year plan. That'd be novel, wouldn't it? Based on land management policy, that would help, would it not? Particularly with the job that you're doing.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I think. I think for any business, just having that ability to plan, to plan in the long term makes a huge amount of difference. Especially in the agricultural world, and it is. Yeah, at the moment it is just difficult given we've had with the uncertainty we've had for the last few years really, and the uncertainty that is still lingering, especially in terms of in the policy arena and what might happen with current agricultural emerging agricultural legislation and environmental legislation. What is going to be the direction of travel for the next 10-15 years would be I think amazingly useful for everyone on this webinar.
We can but dream, guys. You never know. There may be some clarity come the new year. Steve from Berkshire has just put a question in, and I was thinking about this. So I think we need to ask BNG, carbon credits, all the stuff we're talking about in terms of diversifying our alternative incomes. How does that fit into tenant systems, Tom? Because it's all very well if you own your 1,000 acres or your 300 acres, but if you don't, can you help tenant farmers?
Certainly, it's something that we're trying to address, and we are very much considerate of tenant farmers needing to have access to these markets. We're doing a lot of work internally at the moment in terms of trying to design effectively, get our model to work within a tenant farming situation, and we're very hopeful that that's going to come forward very soon. I think the biggest piece of advice I would say at this point for any tenant farmer, and I've seen this with some of the kind of the larger institutional landowners working with their tenants, but I think, you know, having open and honest and frank conversations with your landlord now or as early as possible are only going to kind of help you in the long run. And if you can have those conversations now and at least get the ideas rolling, hopefully, whether it's through us or through various other environmental markets and companies, I think hopefully those kind of opportunities for tenants are going to come in the near future.
Tim Coates, it's tricky for tenants, isn't it? And for landlords, particularly looking at land that they own that they've got rented out, thinking, well, who's going to own the offset here? I mean, that makes it's a tricky conversation to have, because it doesn't talk about it in the tenancy agreement that might have been signed 30 years ago.
Well, absolutely. I mean, in the banking world, we talk about something called counterparty risk, right? To go back to the sort of stress testing idea, and a big thing to stress test is who are all your counterparties. So, you know, we've talked a little bit about suppliers, and we've talked a little bit about people who are buying your output, depending on what market you're in. But, you know, your landlord, if you are a tenant, is obviously a very, very key relationship. You know, I'm both an owner occupier and a tenant, and you know, I probably didn't think that I'd be having quite as many conversations as I do with my landlord about these future opportunities. And I think the way I've always framed it is I'm the delivery partner. If you want access to these things, I'm the person right here who can make it happen. So, you know, be forward thinking, you know, be the person with the idea, and then you're more likely to be to maintain that relationship, rather than, again, it's about being proactive and not letting it happen to you, I think is the point. All of these opportunities can be accessed, but it's then going to come into a slightly different arrangement around the share of the proceeds, so we call it that. You know, maybe that kind of simple rent type arrangement is going to have to evolve and look a bit more like a contract farming profit share type arrangement into the future. Who knows?
It's convincing your landlord that you're key to that future benefit from the land, or that you're key to the whole mechanism. Will, I mean, in terms of when you talk to your tenant clients, of which, you know, there will be many, I mean, it's harder to stress test those businesses to a certain degree, because, you know, there's a lot of difference in terms of on-farm investment between tenant scenarios and owner-occupier scenarios.
Yes, but I think there's a lot of things that we've discussed tonight that they can be doing. And I'd go right back to the start in measure in order to manage. And if you blindly bury your head in the sand and aren't open to change at all, and don't take any measurements as to actually what your level of profitability is, then fundamentally there's a good chance that you're going to struggle. And I think the best businesses, agriculture is a business just like any other industry. You make a plan, you actually take measurements to see how you're going along with that plan, and you have a review period of that, and you evolve. Whether you're a tenant farming business, whether you're an owner-occupied business, whether you are in marketing and printing, you know, the best businesses look back and they evolve. I'm not saying people have to change, but they certainly need to be aware of how they may evolve if, I suppose, the numbers show that it's the right direction to go. So, yeah, sorry, I've probably talked around that question rather than at it, but it's plan, measure, don't be scared to evolve.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like you say, it's knowing your numbers, it's knowing what's going on, so you can actually, well, do what you want to do, and know where to actually take your business, as opposed to stabbing in the dark, effectively. Guys, that's been absolutely fantastic. I'm going to start to draw it to a close now, because we're just coming up to our deadline. Firstly, I'd like to thank all the people that have sent questions in. It's fantastic to hear from you. Thank you so much. We're going to thank our panel. Firstly, Will Foyle, farm business consultant from Hutchinson's. Jeff Claydon is the CEO of Claydon Drills. Tom Mason, senior land manager at the Environment Bank, and Tim Coates, co-founder and chief customer and regulatory officer at the Oxbury bank. Panel, thank you so much for your input this evening. It's been really insightful. I hope you guys tuned in on the webinar, found it useful tonight as well. Don't forget, there is loads of stuff going on within the whole Farmers Weekly transition package, whether it's pullouts in the magazine. There's a whole myriad of podcasts that are already out there. There's a whole load of these webinars that you can pull up as well. If there's a bit of this that you missed that you want to replay, this webinar will be pushed out very soon indeed as a podcast, so you can listen to the whole thing again while you're defrosting water troughs tomorrow morning. But that will appear fairly soon on the Farmers Weekly podcast feed, and you'll be able to listen to it again. But look, thank you so much for taking part tonight, for coming along and listening. Thank you very much for our panel, and thank you to all our production staff as well who have put tonight together. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening. Good night, and we'll see you again soon.